Now, Lindsey, tell us a little bit. We know Debbie Delaney here on King Island. Tell us a little bit about your work and career.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the invitation. So I've been interested in seaweeds for quite some time. I had a previous life. Before I entered academia in the 1990s, I actually quit school when I was 16 and went off and became a laborer and ended up doing various trades and what have you, and ended up as a carpet layer of all things. But then in the 1990s, I had just finished a stint in the United States and decided to come back to New Zealand and get myself an education. I'd always been very interested in things marine. My parents had always had boats in New Zealand. We'd spent a lot of time on and under the water, spearfishing and fishing and all that kind of stuff. And so I was very quickly drawn. I was doing a marine biology major and was very quickly drawn to seaweeds as a very sustainable product. And to seaweed farming, because what I found out through my early education was that seaweeds was one of the most virtuous things you could possibly farm on this planet because it has no inputs like herbicides or pesticides or fertilizers or anything. And it soaks up coastal nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, which in many places are human pollutants into our coastal ecosystems. And so growing seaweeds at scale is actually a hugely sustainable activity. So I've been advocating for seaweed utilization down under in other parts of the world since I sort of started my bachelor's and then moved to a PhD later in the 1990s. I took up an academic position here at my university, at Auckland University of Technology in 2001. And I was very lucky to be included as part of an application for a cooperative research centre in Australia, which is called the Blue Economy CRC, a very large cooperative research centre, the largest one ever funded, 329 million Australian dollars we kicked off with in 2018. And the purpose of the CRC was to take aquaculture offshore, get away from the NIMBYs, and to marry that up with marine renewable energy. And so you go offshore, 10, 15, 100 kilometers into open water. But instead of trucking lots of diesel out there, you harness the energy that's out there. As we all know, an open ocean's got a lot of energy, whether it's wind or waves or sun or so you harness that energy to run your whole aquaculture operations. And so that we kicked off in 2018, as I said. It's also one of the first CRCs that has true partnerships with New Zealand, because, of course, because the CRCs are large or in part funded by the Australian federal government, the CRCs have to be for the benefit of Australia. But this one is a truly Australasian one. And so my university is one of the key research partners in that CRC. And luckily for me, we were able to convince the board and the executive of the CRC that seaweed should be a big part of their portfolio. And so I sit on the science executive of that CRC and have been able to sort of guide several seaweed projects. And so far, the CRC has invested around sort of $9 million dollars into seaweed farming, offshore seaweed farming. Um, and what's germane to this conversation is that very early in the piece, we did a scoping study where one of the seaweed species that we targeted on was Durvillaea or bull kelp, which of course has great relevance to King Island. And the reason for that was that one of our partners is Seasol, the fertilizer company, which most Australians would know about. And they use Durvillaea in their fertilizer products, but there's not enough Durvillaea out there to satisfy them. And so not only do they take material from King Island and I think also from the northwest coast of Tassie, they can't get enough of it and have had to supplement that with bull kelp from other parts of the world, where it's actually wild harvested, not just beach cast. And so they were very interested in a sustainable solution to this in terms of growing the seaweed at scale to provide the biomass that they need for their operations. And then, of course, uh, what happened along the way, and I can describe some of the projects that we've funded, but along the way, a couple of years ago, I happened to be at a aquaculture meeting in Denmark, and I bumped into Alejandro Bushman, who's a professor from the Universidad de los Lagos in Chile, and he's an old seaweed guy from way back, and they have bull kelp over there as well, because of course bull kelp is found on the coast of Chile, in New Zealand, and in Australia, Southern Australia, and Tasmania, and of course King Island. And so I said to him, look, we've got research groups in Australia and New Zealand working on bull kelp cultivation. Have you guys done any work? And he said, oh, yes, Lindsey, we've done some work. And I said, well, wouldn't it be great if we were able to get all three countries' researchers together to sort of push this thing along? And luckily for us, last year, my government, through the Royal Society of New Zealand, funded what's called a catalyst grant, which has provided the opportunity to do exactly that, to get researchers from Chile, from Australia, and from New Zealand together to talk about their progress and to make sure we're not doubling up on research and that we're leveraging each other's research to actually bring bull kelp into cultivation. And so last year in August, we had researchers from New Zealand and Australia visit the Chileans. And now in August and early September, we've got the Chileans and the Australians coming to New Zealand. And then we're going to be visiting King Island and Tasmania, and finishing up in Hobart with a final sort of workshop there. And so that's the sort of basis for this, I guess.
Yeah, well, Debbie, you've been studying King Island's bull cap. We interviewed you in the past and you talked about it. What are you seeing? Is our kelp actually disappearing? And how serious is the decline?
That's some of the stuff I'll be speaking to on Monday or Tuesday the 1st. But yes, my results are already showing a significant decline. So I won't go into the detail now, but certainly since 1975, we've seen a dramatic decrease in the amount of kelp that's processed through kelp industries on the island.
So in 75, if we already saw that, so this is a process what is already going on there for over 50 years.
Correct, absolutely. So production peaked from the factory in 88 or 89 at 4,000 dry weight tons. So that's the amount of kelp that's processed kelp, so not individual kelps off the beach. And so it reached that of 4,000 dry weight ton, and currently it's sitting below 1,000 dry weight ton. That's the scale of decline that we've seen. It's
Yeah.
it's big, and yeah, it's not a pretty story.
What do we know about what's causing the changes? Is it warmer water, marine heat waves, storms, a combination? What is it?
Yep. Again, I encourage people to come along on the Tuesday because I'll certainly be talking about that. So I've looked at long-term sea surface temperature trends, and there's certainly been an increase in sea surface temperature off King. So bearing in mind that satellite data for sea surface temperature only became available from 1981 onwards, but certainly there's been an increase in our sea surface temperature of the island. So also I've looked at marine heat waves, and we're certainly experiencing a number of marine heat waves off King Island. And the ones that we're particularly concerned about are the summer marine heat waves and mortality events off the back. So I've been trying to sort of examine using kelp industries data whether there's a relationship between marine heat waves and the decline in kelp harvest. And then thirdly, so I've looked at something called wave energy flux. So think of it in terms of the amount of power that a wave has. So for the King Island locals, it's those big ground swells where we see the admirals cracking, and there's waves that have got a huge amount of energy. So we're seeing a general looking like, particularly from out of the Southern Ocean, because that drives our weather patterns on King Island from the southwesterlies, and we're seeing a general decline in the number of those large swells, those high energy swells, and a potential relationship with the amount of kelp harvest with that as well.
Hmm. Now, Lindsay, you're looking at seaweed from an international perspective. Is what's happening around King Island unusual, or are you seeing similar changes elsewhere in the world?
Well, there's similar changes with marine heat wave. Marine heat waves have a big impact on seaweeds. You may be aware that another large seaweed, the macrocystis, the giant kelp, they had huge impacts on populations of that kelp around Tasmania through marine heat waves. And so I guess I mean that's the issue. Potentially, the issue with King Island is that while it is the case that things might be declining, that sort of gives us extra impetus for the actual more cultivation side of things. I should point out to listeners though that what's taken as beach cast seaweeds on King Island and other places in Australia and Tasmania, it's completely sustainable because what you take off the beach has no relationship to what's then going to grow later on in the ocean. So this decline has nothing to do with the harvest itself, because of course the seaweed is lying up on the beach. It can't reattach if it goes back into the water. So it doesn't, there's no relationship between what you take from beach cast and the populations in the wild. So what's happening with this decline is, as Debbie said, more likely to be environmental rather than a post-harvest issue, which is a good thing to know that what you're doing is a sustainable activity. But it does point to the fact that cultivation ultimately is probably a better target. And what I'd say for King Island is that given that you have capability in seaweed handling and processing, that if seaweed farming, for example, was to happen in the Bass Strait, it puts King Island at a potential spot for some of that processing capability.
I'd like to sort of point out as well that as an adjunct off the side of my project, of the PhD project, we've also had an honours and a master's student do dive surveys because, as Lindsey said, we also need to understand what the relationship is between the harvest and what's happening in situ in the ocean. And so we've also got presenting on the Tuesday two additional students that have done dive surveys on King Island. One that's got there was dive surveys done in the 80s, and we'll show you the results of what the bull kelp was like in the 1980s on King Island versus now. And then Stu, the other student, has done dive surveys right along the west coast so that we've got a baseline of where it's at now.
Now, Debbie, King Islanders have collected stormcast kelp for generations. With this decline now, could it have a big impact on our kelp industry and local jobs?
Um, that's the subject of later research within a PhD, I guess, is the short answer, Wade. But certainly that's the intent. Once I've finished what I'm currently working on is to move and look at what the socioeconomic effects have been as a consequence of the decline.
Yeah. Do you think that we can actually do anything to protect or restore bull kelp, or are we largely at the mercy of changing ocean conditions?
I think something that's really relevant to point out, this is probably one of the first significant studies. There's other studies into Davilia, but it's quite limited, as Lindsey said. So we're really establishing a benchmark of what's going on and why. So we're very early in the research journey. And as Lindsey will talk about, we're looking at developing other systems like aquaculture. And if we can get aquaculture going, what do we need to do in terms of restoration? So I guess they're for further down the track.
Yeah. Now, Lindsay, you already mentioned kelp farming and seaweed farming. With the waters in the Bass Strait and being fairly wild here now and again, could that be done around King Island, you think?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So we just today received the first annual report of the blue economy aquaculture farms that are sitting in the Bass Strait, about 12 kilometers off of Burnie. And though that infrastructure, now currently the infrastructure is there to farm salmon, and they've got some 12,000 salmon out there, been out there and have exceeded the growth rates that they predicted in the Bass Strait, which is good news. The gear has all survived the weather and the conditions of the Bass Strait for the last year or so. And we're looking to do some seaweed trials on that site within the next year, which is very exciting. And bull kelp will be one of the species that we attempt to grow out there. I should just take one step back and say that the bull kelp that we have in New Zealand, Australia, and Chile Nobody before the Blue Economy CRC started funding projects in this, nobody had ever actually tried to grow it before. And so we were starting at, at year dot, basically, um, trying to figure out all of the things that you need to actually take a species into cultivation. This species had never been cultivated before. And so we started off with some very basic science around its reproductive seasons and seasonality and that kind of stuff. A lot of lab work and also a lot of field work across Tasmania and New Zealand in terms of collecting seaweeds, looking at when the spores were being produced, the gametes were being produced, how to put them together and germinate them and that kind of stuff. And we've now gone through all of that and we've developed hatcheries technologies. And so we know now how to take brood stock from the wild, get the gametes out, make fertilized adults, and grow them at lab scale. The next trials are about growing them successfully at sea, and that's what the Blue Economy Zone will give us. I should mention to listeners also that in New Zealand, we're very interested in bull kelp as a potential species. Particularly the Maori community here, they have a long history using bull kelp for a variety of purposes. They used it in cooking. They even used it to make floats from and to store preserved birds and what have you in them. And we've got a large partnership with a very large iwi or Maori tribe from the Eastern Bay of Plenty who are about to receive about 10,000 hectares of sea space for aquaculture. And just to put that into a bit of context, the entire New Zealand marine farm space at the moment is 6,500 hectares or thereabouts. And so this has the opportunity to really flick a switch across New Zealand and Australia in terms of scale. And that's one of the things that's held seaweed farming back across Australasia is the ability to do things at scale. Because for seaweeds, globally we farm 33 million tons of seaweed across the globe every year. And most of that is done at scale in temperate waters in China, Japan, Korea, and then through the tropics, through Indonesia, the Philippines, and places like that. But in order to do it, and in order to get the funding and infrastructure in place to do it across Australasia, we need to have products that can be produced, manufactured, and sold at scale to provide the access to the kind of investments that will be needed.
Well, I guess the good thing is that with seaweed farming, you don't have to water your plants, do you?
Nope. Nope, there's no inputs whatsoever. It will either grow on your site or it won't. And the funny thing is that, like in the tropics, they have issues with herbivorous fish eating their seaweed. And there's only one way they can get around that, and they have to grow enough seaweed to feed the fish and to harvest for themselves.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
seaweed is increasingly is being promoted for food, fertilizer, animal feed, other products. How big do
absolutely.
you think this industry could eventually become in Australia and New Zealand?
Well, the projections by the FAO and others around the world are that the seaweed industry is going to grow significantly over the next couple of decades, and that what needs to happen is that expansion needs to be into new geographical areas such as Australasia, alongside new product development. So not just the traditional sort of food and fertilizers, but also sort of higher end nutraceuticals and other high-end products. And you might know that a good deal of the bull kelp that gets harvested on King Island actually gets sent to Norway for very highly technical extraction of the alginate, which is the cell wall polysaccharide in this brown seaweeds, because bull kelp has a very unique alginate, and it's quite sought after. And so there will be, pardon the pun, there will be growing demand for growing the seaweed.
Hmm. Now, Debbie, if we came back and had this conversation in 10, 20 years, what do you hope King Island's coastline and kelp forest will look like?
Oh, wouldn't it be great if we're growing it and manufacturing it and value adding what we've got, and that our kelp beds are healthy and we've done restoration of the actual ecosystem as well. So that would be like the dream. Um,
Yeah. I'm sure we encourage everybody to come out on the 1st of September at the King Island Golf and Bowling Club at 7 p.m. What is your motivation to say to people, well, hey, there's enough information here. This is why you should come to this night.
I think sometimes we forget on King Island because we sit there and we do our thing. This is globally significant research. It's not just what's happening on King Island is actually really important, and it's important that we learn more and people care. Like, have a look at the number of people on the island that dive, that fish, that do all of these things. This is an opportunity to come along and probably a once in a lifetime to have researchers from across the globe to hear about what's happening globally as well as what's happening locally, and to just learn a little bit more and all contribute. Like, my research, for example, would not be possible without the King Island community. So come along and be involved, particularly the kelp carters and kelp industries, but anyone that's interested in the marine environment. Like, it surrounds us day in, day out. It's how we survive.
Researcher Deborah Delaney and Professor Lindsey White, I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.